When Australians get hold of a name that suits them, they tend to stick with it in a big way. We can blame this unfortunate custom on Lachlan Macquarie, a Scotsman who was governor of the colony the first part of the 19th century and whose principal achievements were the building of the Great Western Highway through the Blue Mountains, the popularizing of Australia as a name before the whole country was indifferently referred to as either New South Wales or Botany Bay, and the world's first nearly successful attempt to name every object on a continent after himself. You really cannot move in Australia without bumping into some reminder of his tenure. Run your eye over the map and you will find the Macquarie Harbour, Macquarie Island, Macquarie Marsh, Macquarie River, Macquarie Field, Macquarie Pass, Macquarie Plains, Lake Macquarie, Port Macquarie, Miss Macquarie's Chair, a lookout point over Sydney Harbour, Macquarie's Point and Macquarie's Town. I always imagine him sitting at his desk, poring over maps and charts with a magnifying glass and calling out from time to time to his first assistant. "Have you now got to Macquarie's Swamp yet, laddie? And look here, this wee copse. It has nae a name. What shall we call it, do you think?" And that's just some of the Macquaries, by the way. Macquarie is also the name of a bank, a university, the National Dictionary, a shopping centre, and one of Sydney's principal streets. That's not to mention the 47 other roads, avenues, groves, and terraces in Sydney that, according to John Morris, are named for the man or his family. Nor have we touched on Lachlan River, Lachlan Valley, or any other first-name variations that sprang to his tireless mind. You wouldn't suppose there would be much left after all that, but one of Macquarie's successors as governor, Ralph Darling, managed to get his name all over the place too. In Sydney you will find Darling Harbour, Darwin Drive, Darling Island, Darling Point, Darlinghurst, and Darlington. Everywhere elsewhere, Darling's modest achievements are remembered in the Darling Downs and Darling Ranges, a slew of additional Darlingtons, and the important Darling River. What isn't called Darling or Macquarie is generally called Hunter or Murray. It's awfully confusing. Even when their names aren't exactly the same, they're often very similar. There is a Cape York Peninsula in the far north and the York Peninsula in the far south. Two of the leading explorers of the 19th century were called Sturt and Stuart, and their names are all over the place, too, so that you have constantly to stop and think, generally at a busy intersection where an instant decision is required. Now, did I want the Sturt Highway or the Stuart Highway? Since both highways start at Adelaide and finish at places 3,994 kilometers apart, this can be a difference, believe me. I was thinking about all these, the confusion of place names and monuments to Lachlan Macquarie, the following morning because I spent much of it in the grip of the first while in pursuit of the second. I was in a rental car, you see, trying to find my way out of the endless, bewildering sprawl of Sydney. According to the local telephone directory, there are 784 suburbs and other named districts in the city, and I believed I passed through every one of them as I sought in vain for a corner of Australia not covered by bungalows. Some neighborhoods I visited twice at opposite ends of the morning. For a time I thought about just abandoning the car at the curb in Parramatta. I rather liked the name, and people were beginning to wave me familiarly. But eventually I shot out of the city, like a spad bug, pleased to find myself on the correct heading for Lithgow, Bathurst and points beyond, and filled with that sense of giddy delight that comes with finding yourself at large in a new unknown continent. My intention over the next couple of weeks was to wander through what I think is a civilized Australia to the lower right corner of the country, extending from Brisbane in the north to Adelaide in the south and west. This area covers perhaps 5% of the nation's land surface but contains 80% of its people and nearly all its important cities, specifically Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra, and Adelaide. In the whole of the vast continent, this is much the only part that is conventionally habitable. Because of its curve in shape, it is sometimes called the Boomerang Coast. Though in fact my interest was largely internal, I was headed in the first instance for Canberra, the nation's interesting park-like and curiously much current capital. Thence I would cross 800 miles of lonely interior to distant Adelaide before finally fetching up, dusty but ever indomitable, in Melbourne, where I was to meet some old friends who would hose me down and take me off for a long-promised tour of the snake-infested, little visited but gorgeously rewarding Victorian bush. There was much to see along the way. I was very excited. But first I had to make my way through the Blue Mountains, the scenic and long impassable hills lying just to Sydney's west. On approach, the Blue Mountains don't look terribly challenging. They rise to no great height and everywhere wear a softening cloak of green. But in fact they are rent with treacherous gorges and bouldered canyons, some with walls rising sheer hundreds of feet. And that lovely growth proves on close inspection to be of an unusual, tangled and obscuring nature. For the first quarter of a century of European occupation, the Blue Mountains stood as an impenetrable barrier to expansion. Expeditions tried repeatedly to find a way through, but were always turned back. Even if progress could be gained through the lacerating undergrowth, it was nearly impossible to maintain one's bearings amid the wandering gorges. Watkin Tench, a leader of one party, reported with understandable exasperation how he and his men struggled for hours to find a route to the top of one impossibly taxing defile, only to discover when they attained the summit that they were exactly opposite where they expected to be. Finally, in 1813, three men, Gregory Blaxland, William Charles Wentworth, and William Lawson, broke through, exhausted, tattered, and ill with bowel complaints, as Wentworth glumly noted then and on any occasion that anyone would listen for the rest of his long life. It had taken them 18 days, but as they stepped onto the air heights of Mount York, they were rewarded with a view of pastoral splendor never before seen by European eyes. Below them, for as far as the gaze could reach, stretched a sunny, golden Eden, a continent of grass, enough, it seemed, to support a population of millions. Australia would be a mighty country. The news when they returned to Sydney was electrifying. In less than 2 years, a road was cut through the wilderness and the westward peopling of Australia had begun. Today the Great Western Highway, as it is grandly and dramatically known, follows almost exactly the route taken by Blaxland and his companions nearly 200 years ago. It certainly feels venerable. The route goes up and through the mountains and for much of the way passes along such confined spaces that there is no room for a big modern road. So the Great Western has the tight bands and a dealing well width of a road designed for an age when motorists clapped goggles over their eyes and started their car with a crank. I had been through here not long before on the Indian Pacific, but the views from the train weren't good. Glimpsed vistas seen through a picket fence of gum trees, and then, each time, an abrupt veering away into denser woodland, and in a way I had been preoccupied with exploring the train. So I was eager now to see the mountains up close, in particular the famous dreamy views from the little town of Katoomba. Alas, that was not with me. As I followed the tortuous road up into the distant hills, the windscreen became speckled with drizzle and a chill. Swirling fog began to fill the spaces between the couch wood and sassafras trees that loomed upon every side. Very quickly the fog thickened to the density of wood smoke. I had never been out in such fog. Within minutes, it was like piloting a small plane through clouds. There was a bonnet in front of me and then just white. It was all I could do to keep the car fixed to its plane. The road was almost preposterously narrow and twisting, and with the visibility so low, every sudden curve was received with a whip of surprise. At length I reached Katoomba where the fog was, if anything worse. The town was reduced to spooky shapes that loomed out of the murk from time to time, like frights at a funfair ride. Twice, at no more than 2 miles an hour, I nearly drove into the backs of parked cars. I have no idea why I bothered, but having come this far, I found my way to a lookout spot called Echo Point, parked and got out. Not surprisingly, I was the only person there. I went and grasped the railing and gazed out, the way you do it at a looking-out point. Before me there stood nothing but depthless white and that peculiar witchy stillness that fog brings. To my surprise, from out of the milky vapors there emerged an elderly couple, dapper and doddery and bundled up as if for a long winter. The man walked with a particular unsteady gait, propped by a cane on one side and his wife on the other. As they drew level, he looked at me in surprise. "You won't see anything today." He barked as if I was wasting his time as well as my own. I guessed from the volume that he might be a little deaf. "This won't clear for 36 hours. More confidingly he added, "Depression over the Pacific. Often happens." He nodded sagely and joined me in contemplating the nothingness. His wife gave me a tiny smile that was at once apologetic, long-suffering, and a little wistful. "It might clear after a bit," she speculated hopefully. He looked at her as if she had just announced an intention to have a shit on the pavement. "Clear? It's never going to clear. There is a depression over the Pacific." He looked for a moment as if he might swipe her with his cane. Her optimism was not lightly deflected, however. "Don't you remember how it came out all loud at that time at Bunbury?" she said. "Bunbury," he replied incredulously. "Bunbury, that's the other side of the country. It's a different bloody ocean. What are you talking about?" "Are you mad? You want putting away." Suddenly I recognized the accent. He was a Yorkshireman, or at least once had been. "It didn't look like it was going to turn out fine," she went on to me, expecting a more sympathetic hearing, and then it did turn out. "It's a different ocean, woman. Are you deaf as well as mad?" It was clear that his was, at least in the fundamentals, a conversation that they had been having for years. You get a quite different set of meteorological conditions in the Ocean. Quite different. Any fool knows that. He was quiet for half a second, and then said, "I thought we were going for a cup of tea." "We are, dear. I just thought we'd have a little stroll." Deftly she set him in motion again. "A stroll? What for? This bugger all to see. Are you blind as well as deaf and mad? This won't clear for 36 hours. "I know, dear, but—" Within a moment there were just voices floating out of a veil of white, and then they were gone altogether. Reluctant to leave the area, I spent the night in Blackheath, a pretty village in the woods a dozen miles further down the highway. My last view from my motel window before Tonnen Inn was a car passing slowly in the highway, its headlamps like searchlights, and the world settled under a thick eiderdown of milk. It didn't look terribly promising, so you may imagine my surprise when I woke in the morning to find bright sunshine spilled across my bed and feeling the tops of the trees outside. I opened the door to a golden world, so bright it made me blink. Birds were singing in the exotic tones of the bush. I wasted not a moment getting back to Katoomba. The view when I returned to Aka Point was outstanding, a broad vale of very green forest broken at intervals by square tops, outcrops, and fractured pinnacles, the whole filled with a vast and imposing silence. The sky was a rich and all but cloudless blue. Even at 9 in the morning you can tell it was going to be a really hot day. I spent 90 minutes or so walking along the cliff top, enjoying the view from various angles. I had a look at Katoomba Falls and the stranded sandstone uprights known as the Three Sisters, and at length, entirely satisfied, wandered back into town for coffee. In the 1930s and 1940s, Katoomba was a popular retreat for people of a genteel and discriminating nature. It was much less raffish than Bondi and other beach outposts, where there was always the danger that young Bruce and Noeline might be exposed to more flesh than was healthy in their ages, or overhear strong language, men say jisms and truth, and so on. Katoomba offered more refined pursuit, strolls through the woods, a therapeutic dip in a hydro pool, orchestral dancing in the evenings. Today Katoomba clings with a slight air of desperation to its bygone glory. Its main street had a generous sprinkling of Art Deco buildings, notably a wonderful old movie house, though several, including the movie house, were closed. I bought a morning newspaper and found my way into a cafe. It always amazes me how seldom visitors bother with local papers. Personally, I can think of nothing more exciting, certainly nothing you could do in a public place with a cup of coffee, than to read newspapers from a part of the world you know almost nothing about. What a comfort it is to find a nation preoccupied by matters of no possible consequences to oneself. I love reading about scandals involving ministers of whom I have never heard, murder hunts in communities whose names sound dusty and remote, features on revered artists and thinkers whose achievements have never reached my ears, whose talents I must take on faith. I love above all to venture into the color supplements and see what's fashionable for the beach in this part of the world, what's new for the kitchen, what I might get for my money if I had $400,000 to spare and a reason to live in Dubbo or Wallabaloo. There is something about all this feels privileged, almost illicit, like going through a stranger's drawers. Where else can you get this much pleasure for a trifling handful of coins? At this time I was slow following with some devotion a libel trial in which two government ministers were suing a publisher over a book containing scurrilous and, as it proved, groundless allegations implying sexual indiscretions in times gone by, which his passing days to the trial had taken on the most exhilarating air of farce. Just recently, a former leader of the opposition had taken the stand and, for no reason that any sane person could deduce, had begun recounting lively stories of alleged sexual improprieties by other ministers who were not remotely connected to the book of trial. But what had attracted me to the case in the first place, and what made it all seem particularly special, was a simple happy coincidence that the two ministers at the heart of the affair were named Abbott and Costello. So I was sitting happily absorbed in this when I heard a familiar voice say, quite loudly and in a discontented tone, "This is a strawberry jam. It's black currant." I looked up to see my two little old friends from the day before. They were looking much smaller and frailer with their hats and coats and scarves off. These items, neatly folded, were stacked high on their chairs beside them, as if awaiting transfer to a linen cupboard. I wondered if perhaps they were all those clothes, not so much for warmth as because all the dressing and undressing helped them fill their days. They haven't got strawberry, dear, said the wife in a quieter voice. The lady explained. They only have blackcurrant or marmalade. Well, I don't want either. Then don't have either. This said with just a hint of weariness. But it's on my toast. No, dear, that's my toast. I ordered you a jam donuts. Jam donut, jam donut. Are you mad? I don't like jam donuts. This tea is cold. I lowered myself back into my paper, but on the way out I stopped to bid my elderly friends good day. The man clearly didn't have a very real notion who I was. The jam donut, I noticed, had been devoured. Only a small purple dollop gleamed on the plate before him. It's the young man from Echo Point, the woman explained. But her husband was too busy chasing the dollop of jam with a spoon to pay me any heed. I see the weather's cleared, I observed cheerfully. Often happens like that, the man said in a small shout without looking up. I said it wouldn't last 36 hours. We had an experience just like it at Bunbury once, the wife said to me. Terrible fog, and then all of a sudden it came out all lovely and clear. Do you remember that, dear? Quite, said the old man distractedly, coaxing the elusive jam aboard with a forefinger. He lifted the spoon and bunged it in his mouth with a look of immense satisfaction. Quite. And so once more on the wandering road. Beyond Blackheath, the highway began a steep and curvaceous descent towards Lithgow, where it skirted along the hem of the mountains before striking off cross country through grassy plains towards the country town of Bathurst. I was now in the rural heartlands in an area known to geologists as the Murray-Darling Basin. The fields on all sides were filled with tall blunt grass which waved in a languid manner, and there were buttercups in the verges and whole-bathed in the sweetest, brightest sunlight. Here on stateless trees shaded a white farmhouse. There wasn't a gum tree in sight. I couldn't almost be in the American Midwest. The welcoming world I was passing into now wasn't quite original as Blaxland and his cronies had supposed when they first gazed down on it from the heights behind me. When the first settlers stepped from the wooded mountains, they were startled to find herds of cows numbering in the hundreds grazing contentedly on the tall grass, all offspring of the ones that had wandered from Sydney Cove all these years before. The cows, it transpired, had gone around the mountains through an open pass to the south. Now were the fertile plains quite as boundless as had at first been supposed. Good grazing land extended only a few score miles inland from the coast, and even that was subject to the spiriting vagaries of nature. It still is. 100 miles or so north of where I was driving now, on the edge of this grassy zone, stands the little town of Ningan. In 1989, 1990, 1992, 1995, 1996, and 1998 it was devastated by torrential flash floods. For 5 years during this same period, while Ningan was repeatedly inundated, the town of Cobar, just 80 miles to the west, recorded not a drop of rain. This is, if I haven't made it clear already, one tough country. And yet the striking thing about this area was how thoroughly delightful and accommodating it appeared. The farms were neat and trim, and the towns I passed through gave every appearance of a comfortable prosperity. It was impossible to believe that a metropolis of 4 million people lay just over the hills behind. I felt as if I had stumbled into some forgotten, magically self-contained world. There were things out here I hadn't seen in years. Petrol stations with old-fashioned pumps and no canopies over the forecourt, so that you pumped your petrol in full sun, as I'm sure God intended it. Metal pinwheel windmills of the sort that used to stand in every Kansas farm field. Little towns with people in them, people going about their business, greeting each other with a smile and a nod. It all had a familiarity about it, but the familiarity of something I have forgotten. Gradually it dawned on me that I was in the American Midwest, but it was the American Midwest of long ago. I was, in short, in the process of making the marvelous and heartwarming discovery that outside the cities it is still 1958 in Australia. Hardly seems possible, but there you are. I was driving through my childhood. Partly it was to do with that dazzling light. It was kind of pure, undifused light that can come only from a real hot blue sky, the kind that makes even a concrete highway painful to behold and turns every distant reflective surface into a little glint of flame. Do you know how sometimes on very fine days the sun will shine with a particular intensity that makes the most mundane objects in the landscape glow with an unusual radiance, so that buildings and structures you normally pass without a glance suddenly become arresting, even beautiful? Well, they seem to have that light in Australia nearly all the time. It took me a while to recognize that this was precisely the light of Iowa summers from my boyhood, and it was a shock to realize just how long it was since I had seen it. Partly, too, it was to do with the road. Almost all Australian highways are still just 2 lanes wide, and what a difference that makes. You are not cut off from the wider world as you are on the motorway, but part of it intimately connected. All the million details of the landscape are there beside you, up close, not blurred into the some distance, tediously epic backdrop. It changes your whole outlook. There is no point in hurrying when all it's going to do is put you in the feathery wake of that old chicken truck half a mile ahead. Might as well hold back and enjoy the scenery. There is none of that mad, pointlessly urgency, gotta pass this guy, gotta keep pushing, gotta make some miles. That makes any drive on a motorway such an exhausting and unsatisfying business. When you come to a town on such a road, it is an event. You don't fly through a speed, but slow down and glide through in a stately manner like a float in a parade, slow enough to note to pedestrians if you wish to check out the goods in the windows on Main Street. Oh, that's a good price on men's double-knit shirts, you observe in a thoughtful tone. Oh, those lawn chairs were cheaper in Bathurst, for needless to say, you are talking to yourself by now. Sometimes, quite often in fact, you stop for a coffee and browse round the shops. Afterwards, you return to the open road, and naturally at first you go a little too fast, for speed is an instinct, but then, whoops! You round a bend to find yourself fast approaching the back of a cheap lorry kicking out smoke and laboring heavily up a slope. So you draw back and take it easy. You lean an arm on the window sill, lay a finger on the wheel and cruise. You haven't done this for years. You haven't been on a drive like this since you were a kid. You'd forgotten motoring could be fun. I loved it. As if to underscore the agreeable nature of driving experience in Australia, I began to discover that radio stations in country towns specialize in songs from yesteryear. I don't mean songs from the 60s and 70s, but much earlier. This may be the last country in the world where you can turn on a car radio and stand a more than passing chance of hearing Peggy Lee or Julie London, possibly even Giselle Mackenzie, whose popularity in the 1950s can only be attributed to a winning smile and luck to live in undiscriminating age. It would be intemperate to make a sweeping generalization about rural Australian radio stations because I listened to no more than 6,000 or 7,000 hours of them in the time I was there. So I might have missed something good. But I will say this. When our modern monuments have crumbled to dust, when the careless hand of time has worn away all traces of the 20th century, you can be certain that somewhere in Australia country town there will be a disc jockey, say, and that was Doris Day with her classic hit Q Sarah Sarah. I really loved that too, for a week or so. And so by such happy means did I proceed through Lithgow, Bathurst, Blaney and Lyndhurst, and finally at mid-afternoon fetched up in Cowra, a compact and tidy community of 8,207 people in the Lachlan Valley on the Lachlan River, both named, of course, for our old friend Mr. Macquarie. I knew nothing about Cowra, but I quickly learned that it is well known to Australians as the site of the infamous Cowra breakout. During the Second World War, a large prisoner of war camp stood just outside Cowra. One side held 2,000 Italian POWs, on the other were 2,000 Japanese. The Italians were model prisoners. Overcome the mortification of finding themselves taken from the front lines and transported to a distant, sunny land far from the roar of guns, they settled down and made the best of things. So gamely did they cover their disappointment that when it told almost developed a new situation. They worked on local farms and were not lightly guarded. Their officers, I just love this, weren't guarded at all. They were free to come and go as they pleased, and asked only to close their door behind them to keep out the flies. Regularly, they could be seen strolling into Cowra for cigarettes and newspapers, possibly an aperitif at the Lachlan Hotel. The Japanese presented a somber contrast. They refused to undertake work or offer any measure of cooperation. Most gave false names, so painful was the shame of capture. Ridiculously and tragically, in August 1944, in the middle of the night, 1,100 of them staged a suicidal mass breakout, bursting from their barracks with a banzai cry and charging en masse at the guard tower clutching baseball bats, chair legs and whatever other weapons they could contrive. The startled guards poured bullets into the mass, but they were quickly overwhelmed. Within minutes, 378 prisoners had escaped into the countryside. Quite what they expected to do out there is anyone's guess. It took 9 days to round them all up. The furthest any of them had got was 15 miles. And the Japanese casualties were 231 killed and 112 wounded. The Australians suffered 3 killed on the night, and a 4th during the hunt afterwards. All this commemorated in photographs and other displays at Cowra's Visitors Centre, which in itself was excellent. But in a room at the back was a small audiovisual theatre that was one of the most enchanting things I believe I have ever seen, certainly ever seen in a small country town in the middle of nowhere. Behind glass on a kind of small stage were objects saved from the Pearl camp. Some books and diaries, a couple of framed photographs, a baseball bat and glove, a medicine bottle, a Japanese board game. As I entered, the lights automatically dimmed in the room. A little introductory music played, and then, this was the enchanting part, a young woman about 6 inches high stepped out of one of the framed photographs and began moving around among the objects and talking about Cowra in the 1940s and the prison breakout. My mouth fell open. She didn't just move about but interacted with the objects, stepped around books, idly leaned on the shell casing as she went through her presentation. As you can imagine, I got up and had a closer look, and I can tell you that no matter how close you go to the glass, and I had my head pressed up against it the way children do when they wish to be amusing. You couldn't see the artifice. She was a perfectly formed, full-colored, charmingly articulate, rather dishy three-dimensional person right in front of me and only 6 inches high. It was the most captivating thing I had seen in years. It was obvious that it was a film projected in some way from beneath, but there wasn't a stutter or bump, no scratchy lines or wriggly hairs. It was as real as an image can get. She was a perfect little hologram. The narrative, it is worth noting, was sympathetic and informative, a model of its type. I watched it 3 times and couldn't have been more impressed. Good, eh? Beamed a lady at the reception desk, seeing the amazed look of my face when I emerged. I'll say, anticipating my questions, she passed me a laminated card that explained how it was all done. The display was created by a company in Sydney, employing an optical trick that has been around for well over a century. It was all to do with projecting an image onto a glass plate artificially positioned in such a way as to become invisible to the spectator. Beyond that, the only real trick was taking fastidious care that the actors hit her marks exactly. It must have taken months. It was simply brilliant. And I will say, when they figure a way to get the little person to lap dance, they will make a fortune. I ended the day at Young, a farming town in plum and cherry country 40 miles down the Olympic Highway from Cowra in the direction of Canberra. I got a room in a motel on a side street, not far from the town centre. The owner, a fit-looking fellow in shorts and a short-sleeved shirt, read my name off the registration card and said, "G'day, Bill. Welcome to Young," and gave my hand a powerful shake as if inducting me into a secret society. The friendliness of Australians, all of it quite sincere and spontaneous as far as I could ever tell, never ceases to amaze or gratify. I had never had a motelier pump my hand before or act so pleased that fate had thrown us together. "Glad to have you," he went on, still pumping away. My name Bruce, or whatever it was, for I was too disarmed in every sense to catch it. "Well, g'day, Bruce," I stammered uncertainly. "I'm Bill." "Yes, Bill, we've established that." He said and dropped my hand abruptly. "You're in room 6. I took my key to my room, opened the door and stepped in. The room was, in every tiny particular, from 1958. I don't mean that it had not been decorated since 1958 or anything remotely disrespectful. I mean that inside that room it was 1958. The walls were paneled in knotty pine. The TV had a UHF dial on it. The toilet seat had been gift-wrapped with a sanitized for your convenience wrapper. In a drawer in the bedroom were 2 complimentary postcards featuring views of the motel and a paper bag into which I was urged, for my further convenience, to place unflushable objects. The bag bore a drawing of a lady to tip us off, presumably that it was intended for female personal things rather than, say, corn cobs or small engine parts. I could not have been happier. I dumped my stuff and walked into town through the baking end-of-day heat. Now I saw the 1950s everywhere. Even the children's crossing signs in Australia, I noticed, show kids in 1950s attire. A little girl in a party dress, a boy in short trousers. Superficially, Young didn't look terribly much like the towns I had grown up with. The exceptionally wide streets, they love really wide streets in Australia country towns, the red tin roofs, the metal awnings that run like hot brims around every commercial building. All this was indubitably Australian, but in the way it worked, and what it contained, Young was uncannily familiar. This was a place where, when I had an errand to run, you drove into town, not out of it, and parked in an angled slot on Main Street. This alone was enough to hold me transfixed for some minutes. I had forgotten that there was a time when a little parking along Main Street was all a community needed. I walked around in a state of the profoundest admiration. Except for the banks and the supermarket, the businesses were locally owned with all the peculiarities of taste and presentation that implies. There were shops here of types I hadn't seen in years, fixed shops and little electrical shops, bakeries, cobblers, tea rooms, and sometimes they sold the most extraordinary combinations of goods. At the far end of the main street, I came across one place so exceptional in this respect that it stopped me in my tracks. It was a shop that sold pet supplies and pornography. I am quite genuine. I stood back to stare at the sign, then peered through the window and finally stepped inside. It was a smallish shop, and I was the only customer. On a raised platform about halfway back sat a man beside a cash register reading a newspaper. He didn't say hello or make any acknowledgement, which seemed odd, very un-Australian, until I realized he was being discreet. I imagine most of his customers do what I was doing now. Wander around showing an unwanted interest in catnip and flea powders, pausing from time to time to study the labels on canisters of fish flakes and the like, before ending up entirely by accident at the back of the shop in the heavy-breathing section. Remarkably, this is what happened to me now. The adult section was partitioned into a little compound, with admission through a wooden gate. As I stood there, the gate made a small electronic buzzing sound, the kind of buzz that is made in office buildings when a door is opened from a remote location, and swung to in a provocative manner. I looked around, surprised. The man was still, to all appearances, absorbed in his newspaper. He seemed unaware that I was even in his shop, much less on the threshold of porno heaven. I grinned foolishly and thought about approaching him to explain that he had just made a quite understandable but nonetheless comical error, that I, far from being a desperate pervert in need of pictorial nutrition, was in fact a respectable travel writer drawn to his shop by an unusual juxtaposition of its contents. Then we would have a good laugh and possibly strike up a correspondence. But then it occurred to me that if I did buy something, I am not suggesting for a moment that I would, but on the other hand I still had nothing for the kids. I probably wouldn't want my business card pinned to his bulletin board. It also occurred to me that I had a certain duty to find out if there was some unexpected connection between two strands of his business. Perhaps petting had a whole different meaning in rural Australia, to say nothing of dog fancier. For all I knew, the rags beyond the barrier were full of publications with frisky, animalistic title, prime mounts, whip and collar sheep frolics. Who could say? Clearly I had a duty to find out, so I resumed my expression of sober perusal and stepped inside. I had never actually been in one of these places before, and by that I don't mean a pet supply parlor. And frankly, I was shocked. The participants were human, not animal. It certainly was 1958 at the back of the pet food shop in Young. That's all I am saying. Gratified through I was to find a pornographic pet supply store in Young, or indeed anywhere. My business there was of a slightly more elevating nature. I had come to see the famous Lambing Flat Museum, which commemorates the town's days of glory as a gold mining outpost. It was too late to visit the museum that afternoon, but I presented myself at the front door at 9 a.m. the next morning, only to find that the museum didn't open till 10. Never one to waste a living moment, I decided to repair to a town center cafe for breakfast and prepare myself with a little background reading. Thus, I was to be found 10 minutes later sitting in a mostly empty establishment on Young's Main Drag, drinking coffee, waiting for eggs and bacon, and delving through a hefty one-volume paperback history of Australia by the noted historian Manning Clark, which I had purchased a few days earlier in Sydney. This history of gold in Australia is a lively and generally heartwarming tale. It begins with a fellow named Edward Hargraves, who in 1849 travelled from Sydney to the California goldfields hoping to make his fortune. In 2 years of digging he found nothing but dirt, but he did notice an uncanny similarity between the gold-bearing terrain of California and the land of New South Wales beyond the Blue Mountains, the countryside I had just been driving through. Hastening back to Australia before anyone else was struck by a similar thought, Hargraves began to hunt in the creek beds around Orange and Bathurst and very quickly found gold in payable quantities. Within a month of his discovery, 1,000 people were swarming through the district, turning over rocks and banging away with picks. Once they knew what to look for, they began to find gold everywhere. Australia was swimming in the stuff. An Aboriginal farm worker tripped over one lamb that yielded nearly 80 pounds of precious ore, an almost inconceivable amount to be found in one place. It was enough to ensure a life of princely splendor, or would have been, except that as an Aborigine he wasn't allowed to keep it. The rock went instead to the property's owner. Scarcely had this rush got underway that gold was found in even more luscious quantities over the border in the newly created colony of Victoria. Australia became seized with a gold fever that made the California rush seem almost pale and decisive. Cities and towns became visibly depopulated as workers left to seek their fortunes. Shops lost all their clerks, policemen walked off their posts. Wives came home to find a note on the table and the wagon gone. Before the year was out, it was estimated that half the men in Victoria were digging for gold, and thousands more were pouring into the country from abroad. The gold rush transformed Australia's destiny. Before it, people could scarcely be induced to settle there. Now a stampede rose from every quarter of the globe. In less than a decade, the country took in 600,000 new faces, more than doubling its population. The bulk of that growth was in Victoria, where the richest goldfields were. Melbourne became larger than Sydney and for a time was probably the richest city in the world per head of population. But the real effect of gold was to put an end to transportation. When it was realized in London that transportation was seen as an opportunity rather than a punishment, that convict desired to be sent to Australia, the notion of keeping the country a prison became unsustainable. A few boatloads of convicts were sent to Western Australia until 1868. They would find gold there as well, in equally gratifying quantities. But essentially the gold rush of the 1850s marked the end of Australia as a concentration camp and its beginning as a nation. Despite all the wealth that was to be found, things weren't always so easy for the diggers. In the hope of giving everyone a fair crack, prospectors were allowed to stake out only very modest claims, an area of just a few square yards. And here was where the problems began. When in April 1860 gold was found at Lumming Flat, as Young was then known, fortune seekers turned up in quantities. By 1861, 22,000 people, among them 2,000 Chinese, were digging away, each on a plot of land about the size of a large throw rug. Inevitably, most weren't finding much. Many of the miners began to cast resentful glances at the Chinese, who seemed to bear the heat and privation more cheerfully than their European counterparts, and who cooperated in a way that was felt to give them an unfair advantage. Also, they seemed to be finding more gold. Also, they were Chinese. The upshot of that, the white diggers decided to go and beat up the Chinese. That would make things much better, surely. So, in the middle of 1861, a substantial minority of the white miners, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000, it appears, got together and staged a riot. It was a curiously organized affair. To begin with, the rioters brought in a brass band, which played Rule Britannia and the Marseillaise, among other rousing songs deemed suitable for a civil disturbance. They also made and carried a large banner, which has since become something of an icon in Australian history. So, as the band played the kind of tunes normally heard at a Sunday afternoon park concert, the miners moved through the Chinese area, beating people up with pickaxe handles or worse, robbing them and setting their tents alight. Then, just to make a day of it, they went on to burn down the courthouse. Afterwards, 11 of the rioters were tried, but none was convicted. Obviously not Australia's proudest moment. What was the immediate outcome of all this, I can't tell you. Manning Clark, who is, I just have to say this, a most exasperating historian, mentions that one European miner was killed in the fray, but gives no hint as to how many Chinese died or were injured. Nor does he say what became of them afterwards, whether they were driven permanently from the site or whether things settled down and they returned to work. What is certain is that the Lambing Flat riot led to the adoption of what became known as the White Australian policy, which essentially forbade the immigration of any non-European people until the 1970s. It would, and I really don't mean a pun here, color nearly every aspect of Australian life for over a century. The Lambing Flat Museum was a large, old single-story brick building on a side street. I was there for the opening of the front door, an event that seemed to involve a great deal of unbolting and fiddling with a set of keys by someone on the inside. I began to suspect that it wasn't quite as popular or important an institution as I had supposed. For when the door swung open and the lady nearly jumped out of her skin. "Oh, you gave me such a start," she said, chuckling merrily as if I had played a waggish joke on her, which left me with the impression that visitors were perhaps somewhat occasional. Anyway, she seemed glad to have me and, after accepting my $3 admission, urged me to take my time and come straight to her if I had any questions. The museum was quite large and filled with the most extraordinary collection of stuff: flat irons, boot lasts, a buggy, old lanterns, odd fragments of machinery. Except for the absence of cobwebs, I could have been in my grandfather's barn. In a corner of the main room I found the centerpiece of the museum's collection, the large banner that the rioters carried in 1861. It is known as the roll-up flag because neatly embroidered across it are the words roll up, no Chinese." In his book A Secret Country, which I had read before coming to Australia, the Australian journalist John Pilger suggests that the Lambing Flat Museum rather glorifies the event and offers nothing in the way of contrition. If that was true when Pilger visited, his book was published in 1999. It no longer is. The labels give a balanced and thoughtful account of the riots, though again with a curious blankness regarding casualties numbers on either side. The museum went on and seemed to contain everything that everyone in young had ever acquired and no longer wanted. Sewing machines, adding machines, rifles, wedding albums, christening guns. On a table was a large gel filled with small shiny black spheres, thousands of them. I peered at it, trying to figure out what it was. "Canola seeds," said a voice, quite near, so near it made me jump. I turned to find the lady who had let me in. "Oh, you made me jump," I said, and she smiled in a way that made me suspect that had been her intention. Perhaps, it occurred to me, that was how people passed the time in young. "Are you finding everything?" she asked. I looked at her with interest. How would I know if I was or not? But I replied, "Yes, I am," then added politely, "It's very interesting." "Yes, there is a lot of history in young," she agreed and looked around as if thinking perhaps there was too much. My gaze returned to her jar of seeds. "Do you grow a lot of canola around here?" I asked. "No," she said simply, and considered this and tried to think of something more to say. "Well, you've got the seeds if you decide to start," I observed helpfully. "Some people call it rape," she said, all but whispering the last word and raising her eyebrows significantly. "Yes," I agreed in what I believed was a concerned tone. "I prefer canola." "Me too. I don't know why I said that. I have no position on seed names, however emotive, but it seemed prudent to agree with her. Mercifully, just then a bell went, the kind of bell that sounds when someone comes in a shop entrance, and she excused herself. I waited half a dozen beats, then followed her out, for I had seen all I needed to, and I wanted to get a move on. In the front hallway, a middle-aged couple were in the process of buying tickets. The space was confined, and I had to wait for them to step aside to let me out, and I thanked the white-haired lady as I passed. "You enjoyed it, did you?" she asked. "Very much," I lied. "You're on holiday?" asked the lady customer, presumably picking up on my accent. "Yes, I am," I lied again. "How are you enjoying Australia?" "I love it." This would not lie. But she looked at me doubtfully. "Honestly," I added. Then a rather strange thing, well, I thought it was strange. The female customer placed a hand on my forearm and said, with a touch of real anxiety, "I hope everyone is nice to you." I looked at her. "Of course they will be," I said. "Australians are always nice." She gave me a look of imploring earnestness. "Do you really think so?" "Now, don't get me wrong, Australians are the most wonderful people, but when they grow introspective, it's sometimes a little strange." I nodded. "Really," I said reassuringly, "Australians are always nice." "'Cause they are, Maureen," barked her husband. "Salt of the earth. Now let the poor man go. I'm sure he has places he wants to be." He was clearly from the other, heartier school of Australian archetypes. The one that thinks that any bloke not lucky enough to be born in Australia is tragically ill, favored by fate, and probably has a tiny dick as well, poor bastard. And he was right, of course, about having places to be. I mean, it was time to move on to Canberra.